Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, and I can see that you guys are excited in the live chat. Before I start this discussion with my respected guests, I want to make two announcements. One, yesterday's live streaming was deleted and taken down by YouTube, accusing me of spreading misinformation about the case of Navalny. However, I appealed the decision and I proved to them that the information that I mentioned with the documents and the videos were all correct, and they have allowed me again to post the same video. Today, with very limited, it seems, reach, they suppressed the video and the reach of that video. The second announcement is, in Syria, in the city of Raqqa, guys, there was a family, a Christian family, between quotations, of course. This family were expelled from the city of Raqqa in 2015. Their home was taken over by ISIS, and they were kicked out of the city, and they were forced to leave to Aleppo. And these families, let's say, business is completely tarnished and completely destroyed, and they're not able to generate any income for the family. And I myself, I organized a crowdfunding to manage a taxi car, cost only $2,000 for this family. The link of the crowdfunding is in the description below. If you trust me, I can assure you that I will, when I secure this $2,000, I will arrange a modest taxi car for the father of this family, and he will, of course, generate some income for his family and for his kids. He has 2 kids and a wife, and their financial situation is very, very dire. If you donate only $1 or $2, rest assured that in a few days we will make it, and I will make sure that this family have a better future. Now, I'm joined today with Steve Sweeney and Joti Brar to discuss the future of global politics. And Joti is the vice chair of the Communist Party of Great Britain, and Steve Sweeney is a journalist and war correspondent. Guys, their Telegram accounts are in the description below. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you both on my channel, Syriana Analysis. I would like you to share your valuable insight about many of the hot topics that we discussed today on the online community, and I think the audience of Syriana Analysis would appreciate it. So thank you so much.
No worries.
Joti and Steve, given that both of you were outside the High Court and gave speeches in defense of Julian Assange, do you think the judges will finally set Julian free, given the accusations against one of the judges that he was previously paid to represent the interests of the MI6 and the British Ministry of Defense, whose activities WikiLeaks has exposed? I would like to start with Joti.
Thanks, Kevork. Well, you've highlighted something really important, haven't you? Which is, through this process, along with a bunch of other processes, which I think really began back at the time of the invasion of Iraq, we have this deepening crisis of legitimacy, whereby more and more the workings of the state, the establishment, are being laid bare for us. And we find out that what we were taught to believe in and revere as a kind of almost godlike system of, heaven brought laws and rules that mean that your life will run properly. If you abide by these rules, life will work, society will function. We've been taught to revere these rules to keep us in order, but our rulers do not respect them at all. They will trample on any rule that gets in the way of what it is they want to do. So we see, when we look at the proceedings against Julian Assange, it's a sham. It's a travesty of a proceeding where they've turned everything upside down. You've got this upside down situation where it's essentially, you see that guilty conspirators are presiding at the bench, and the righteous accuser is in the dock, not even able to make it to the dock. Why? Because they've weaponized the prison system to actually, physically destroy the man, day by day. And it's a punishment beating. It's a retribution against him as an individual, but also it's a message to freedom-loving people all over the world. Wherever you are, if you stand in the way of our interests, we can come for you.
Yes.
And we've seen the absolute contempt the British ruling class has for its own rules. We've also seen the way they identify their interests with the interests of the US empire, US imperialism. Our rulers obviously consider the interests of the USA to be paramount to their own ability to maintain their position in the club of global exploiters. And that really, what we're seeing reveals the true nature of free speech, which extends as far as property relations are unaffected. And as soon as the ability of the exploiters to exploit comes under threat, free speech suddenly isn't worth the paper it was written on. And the same, we're seeing the truth about journalism, right? That the bought and paid for prostitute fraternity are paid to prettify the system and repeat the lies of the powerful. They're not there to hold power to account, as we were always told they were supposed to be doing. So my feeling is, if it's left to the British ruling class, they're going to continue, as they have so far, to prostitute themselves in the interests of imperialism and to hand Julian over. The one small light that's been shone is the very belated ruling in the Australian Parliament. And I think that the only reason that's happened now is because of pressure from below. And ultimately, it's pressure from below that's going to force, if anything is going to shift our rulers out of their determination to hound Julian to death, which is essentially what they're set on. The thing that's going to shift them is public pressure. And I think maybe you'll bring this up later, but that brings us back to the key question of why haven't the trade unions in Britain, because it's on British soil where Julian's persecution is taking place, why haven't the trade union movement, the anti-war movement, the National Union of Journalists, why have they not been mobilizing a mass movement to refuse to allow this to continue?
Wow. I think one of the issues why is because they portray Julian Assange as being an activist, as being a hacker, for example. I just want to mention one small incident because compared to Julian Assange, whatever happened with me in the past is nothing comparable to him. But what they do is basically, for example, since I live in Germany and I do my journalistic work and everybody can see what I do, I'm spreading information and my point of view of what's happening around the world and also reporting, doing journalistic job of what's happening in Syria. So what they do basically is they come here and they, for example, they send you to court, right? But you're deprived of your right as a journalist to have a freedom to express your opinion if they deprive you or strip you from the label of journalist. So once you go to court or you are going to defend yourself and they're arguing whether the opposite side or the judges say, but we don't consider you a journalist. We consider you an activist. We consider you, for example, having ties to governments here and there. So this is, I think, the recipe how they try to strip any person of his journalistic protection and his right to have freedom of whether it's expression or publication. And in this case, this is not only exclusive to the people in power and in authority, but also the people who are supposed to watch the authorities, right? And those are the journalists. And this is an article published only recently on the 21st of February. And this is an automatic translation from German. It's called The Myth of the White Knight. And if we see what the German author or the journalist argues here, he says Assange was subjected to angry curses and fantasies of killing, especially from conservative circles. This is not 100% true because even Hillary Clinton was fantasizing of joining him, but he's trying to make this as if it's only from the right-wing side. And he says at the core of the criminal law, however, there is no indication that judiciary cannot ultimately come to a clean verdict. And here he says, please note, Assange is not charged with disseminating secret documents, but with inciting and aiding and abetting data theft. This is also an important difference because Assange always describes himself as a journalist and sees the judicial proceedings as an attack on press freedom. In fact, Assange is least of all journalists and more of a hacker and activist. Steve, so according to this German author, there is no indication of a future unfair trial for Assange, despite him agreeing that there are some fantasies in Washington, D.C. of killing and murdering Julian Assange. And secondly, he says Julian Assange, he is not a journalist, but a hacker and an activist. Yourself, a journalist, when you read other journalists are smearing and attacking someone like Julian Assange, how does it make you feel and how do you respond to these allegations?
Well, I mean, just to start, I think that the reason that they don't deem Julian as a journalist and they don't view him as a journalist is because he's not part of their club. And I think that's something that's very, very important, because that club is very narrow now. And even over the past 10 years, I think that the kind of the window of what's acceptable to say and to not to say, that kind of window or has become very, very narrow now, and you can see it now in how the Ukraine conflict is reported. You can see it in how the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza is being reported. And even, I think, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's become more problematic when you're seeing journalists like John Pilger, for example, who was an incredible award-winning journalist, a very good friend of Julian Assange, a campaigner for his freedom. But he also got pushed out to the margins along with other journalists like Robert Fisk. These are serious journalists, people that were carrying out very good quality investigative work. They were people that would go sort of report from the ground. But the whole notion of press freedom itself is I think, a kind of an abstract freedom in a way, because we all have the right of freedom of speech. Allegedly, we all have the right to press freedom, but we can't all exercise it in the same way. I have the same right to freedom of speech as somebody like Rupert Murdoch, but the difference is I'm not a billionaire and I don't own the pretty much the entire global news network, so I can't set that agenda. But I think there was a big battle to get Julian recognized as a journalist, and it's not just from other journalists. It was also from my trade union, the National Union of Journalists, which, to their shame, were nowhere to be seen over the 2 days of the court hearing. Now, this is the biggest civil liberties case, I think, in modern history, and my union should have been mobilizing en masse its entire membership across the board. There were journalists there, of course, but they were there as journalists. They were reporting on the trial. They weren't there as supporters of Julian. They weren't there to defend that notion of free speech or free press or whatever it is that they think that this case is about. They were nowhere to be seen. And it's not just the National Union of Journalists. It's across the board. There's I would say, an entire conspiracy that colludes with the state. You look at the press freedom organizations. I call it the press freedom business or the press freedom racket. And you can look at these organizations. Reporters Without Borders were there for the trial. They gave one of their representatives gave a speech at the official rally. But of course, it took them a long time to actually agree that Julian was a journalist. This is an organization that is bankrolled by a rogues gallery of the worst people across the globe. The National Endowment for Democracy, the Ford Foundation, all of these kind of organizations. And Reporters Without Borders were one of the organizations that was that led a campaign lobbying for Russian media to be censored across Europe. So it is quite bizarre for a press freedom group. So the thing is, when you step out of line and when you're not part of that club, then either things happen like with Julian. Obviously, now he was incredibly effective. That's he lifted the mask on the war crimes of the rich and the powerful across the world, mainly the United States and Britain, but of course others as well. So it was because he was effective and because he became a threat to the state that they have to keep him behind bars. One as to deter him and to stop him from carrying on what he was doing, but also as a threat to others. Now, I myself, again, we've had experiences as a journalist that doesn't really follow the narrative of the mainstream media, reporting on the ground from various countries across the world. And I can give you a couple of examples. For example, you'll remember maybe when I was heading to Nicaragua to cover the elections there. These were elections that the United States had already said that they weren't going to recognize. That the United States had already said we're going to impose sanctions on Nicaragua. And of course, we don't need to go into the history between the United States and Nicaragua, of course, but they'd recently been labeled part of the troika of tyranny, with Cuba and Venezuela. And I went to report on the elections there, and I was detained. I was held in prison at the behest of the United States, we believe. Now, the press freedom organizations contacted me almost instantly because they'd heard about my plight. And every single one of them, once they realized that it wasn't Nicaragua that had stopped me going to report on the elections. I was the only British journalist, by the way, for a national newspaper that was going in to report on the elections. There was no other media organization going in there. So, of course, once they realized that, they dropped me like a sack of the proverbial. So
Wow.
they weren't interested. So they're part of that framework of that's conspiring against Julian. It's a kind of a racket across the board, really. And if you of course look at the workings of the world of journalism, the murky world of journalism, nearly all of them have trod the same path. They've all gone to Oxford or Cambridge University. They've studied PPE, and of course that's why Noam Chomsky said, isn't it? I think in an interview with Andrew Marr, the British broadcast journalist, he sat down and he said, well, you're only where you are because you say the things that you do. And he's absolutely right. But I think journalism really has deteriorated quite rapidly. And of course, if you dare to report on Ukraine, and I've reported from the ground, and I tell a very different story from the one that's in the majority of the Western press, because I see with my own eyes what happens there. Then you end up, for example, I ended up coming back to Britain, and my bank account was closed down because of my political views. And this is a bank account I've held for 34 years. I then get placed on a kill list by the Mirotvorets kill list, which is hosted in Langley, Virginia, in the United States, which coincidentally happens to be the home of the CIA. And of course, I've been placed on that kill list, and it's a very real threat, actually, because people on that list have in fact been killed by the Ukrainian forces. Again, nothing from my government to express their outrage on that. And of course, I was shot at in Ukraine just a few weeks ago because from reporting on the ground. So it's very difficult to be a journalist that's outside of that mainstream narrative, and to do anything that challenges that. You're either a crank, you're put in prison, or you're threatened with being killed. So it's a very difficult world at the moment, I think.
Actually, this is something that very important when you mentioned about closing your bank account, for example. And this is something I argued since I came to Germany. And there are a few things that I have never spoken about, but I applied for scholarships, for example, here in Germany, and I wasn't accepted. And then when I checked the people who were accepted it's in media field, right? You see that they picked 5, for example, from Syria, and none of them have any journalistic background. They are engineers, they are from chemistry and other faculties, but they got a scholarship in media, international media studies, because of their political opinion, right? You have to have the correct political opinion. And if you want to apply for a job in Germany, do you think there is any newspaper or TV channel would hire me? Zero, right? And after that, they come even after you, and they want to try to close your bank account. They want to close your YouTube channel. They want to just cut you from all your finances. So this is the smarter authoritarian way that they adopted here in this part of the world, compared to the less smart way, for example, in other countries where they just throw someone, a dissident, in jail. Here they cut him from his finances. They put him in economic jail, right? If you can't feed your family, what do? You have to submit, or you have to leave the country at the end, right? And this is becoming also more global. For example, on the United States level, and here I want to speak with Joti, many people say the US has lost the remaining credibility. Especially with the persecution of Julian Assange, given the claim that Washington champions freedom of expression, freedom of press worldwide, not only in the United States, but they want to come to my country and they want to teach me what freedom is, right? And on top of that, we have now a situation where the United States is complicit with the Israeli onslaught on Gaza directly. The people are asking this question: is policy shift within the US possible, or there has to be a structural destruction of the policy making circles in the United States for us to have an opportunity to see the United States acting as a sane country, as a normal country?
Yes, the second one. Fundamentally, you're right. There is a crisis of legitimacy, and the crisis of legitimacy has gone alongside with the drive to war by the USA. Let's not forget that the real beginnings of people's awakening and the deepening of their cynicism started with Iraq, really, truly. The way that we were pushed into the war in Iraq on a whole load of lies, which turned out to be lies, and WikiLeaks was part of the process of revealing that they were lies. And not only did it turn out that the things we were told were lies, but we got evidence that our leaders knew they were lying to us from the beginning. Now, we have to go back 20 years and remember how people tended to think then. I was a communist then, or I already knew they were lying. But most people around me believed that the people in power, when they said things, they believed them. And they believed that the people in power were acting for the best, had the best of intentions, were just doing their best in difficult situations, were genuinely trying to do the things they said they were trying to do. And Iraq was the beginning of people learning that that wasn't true, learning that their views didn't count. 2 million people on the streets protesting against going to war in Iraq, and the government felt safe to ignore them, right? Yes. So there was a sense of like, how did that happen? And lots of people went home kind of demoralized from that. Oh, there's no point organizing. But they also went home beginning to be cynical about the media and about politicians. And that cynicism has grown and grown and grown until we have a situation, and it's been fed by many things. A big part of it is economic crisis of the system, which is making people poorer. It's the increasing gap between their real life experience and what the people in charge tell them. They tell them they've never had it so good and they live in the best country and they're free. And they're living in a situation where they see their life getting worse all the time, year on year, decade on decade. So there's a jarring disconnect between what the people in power say about their freedom and their liberty and what they're experiencing. And then, of course, there's not only been Iraq, there's been Libya, there's been Syria, there's been COVID, there's been, for us, we had Brexit. For you guys, there was Trump and Russiagate. You're not in America, are you? But, for Americans. So there's this, there have been many, many waves. And then, of course, there's this massive inflation crisis that the whole world is suffering from now because of the fact that the imperialist bankers have been printing money to escape from the last financial crisis. And all that's done is kick the can down the road and mean that the financial crisis that's coming is going to be even worse. And of course, the poor are constantly expected to pay the price for all of this. So there's this growing disconnect between the people in power and the people on the ground. And in particular, this crisis of our faith in the concept of democracy. In Britain, we had it with Brexit. We were told we had a choice whether we're in the EU or not, and we voted. And then we had a 3.5-year parliamentary sit-in while our rulers went, how the hell do we not do Brexit? Or how do we do a Brexit that isn't really Brexit, but sort of looks like it might be to fool people? And essentially wouldn't do anything apart from argue about how not to do Brexit in Parliament for 3.5 years after they told us that we had a democratic right to make this decision and gave it to us. Then they were like, no, wrong answer. And for a week after that we gave the wrong answer, all anyone could talk about was whether it was right for poor, uneducated people to be allowed to vote. They were so upset that we voted the wrong way. So there's this total crisis of legitimacy. But what's underpinning all of that is the fact that people are discovering truths about the system, right? It's not that, the system used to work and now it doesn't. But the system is in crisis, in decline. It's unable to deliver the bribe to working people that stopped them from noticing what was wrong with the system. Now it's becoming more and more evident to more and more people that the system doesn't deliver for them. And the thing is, it never will, Kevork. There isn't an answer. There isn't a way to make democracy work again. Democracy and capitalism was always only democracy for the rich. Yeah. We put up with it when our lives were all right. But as we start to realize that this system offers nothing to us except for a descent into poverty and a drive into war, and that there's no way out of that within capitalism, then I think people have to start to realize that if we want sanity, we need to get out of capitalism.
Mhm. Actually, you mentioned brilliant examples from the past, and in the near history, for example, many of the communists were already they were doubtful of the narratives from the United States. I myself, I am not a communist. I didn't grow up in a communist family, but I can smell a BS when I see it. It's too easy nowadays to detect it in the mainstream press and the legacy media, especially when you turn on your TV and you see these talking heads. They are insulting my intelligence. When I watch it, I feel like somebody is humiliating me. I have to change it very quickly. I only watch football nowadays on TV. Otherwise, I feel like they're trying to occupy my private intellectual space here and tell me how I should feel and think. This is no more journalism. When you guide people to how they should act and how their decisions should be made, this is social engineering. This is propaganda. So, but despite that, they have all the freedom to say what they want to say, right? I don't want them to close their media outlets. I just want them to give me my freedom to say the other side of the story and leave the audience to judge. Because I am a person who believe in when you utter the truth has energy, it has power, and when you speak the truth, the person in front of you can feel that you are truthful with them. So if this one person is turning on the TV and watching these talking heads, and then coming to one of the, for example, brilliant journalists on Rumble or on YouTube and watching an analysis of what's happening around the world, they will know the difference right away because people are intelligent. That's why the independent journalists, in my opinion, pose a threat to the narrative. And the social media social media is now a double-edged sword. It can be used by the establishment against the people, but we can also use it against them. So that's why we have now what they call you are free to say what you want to say, but you're not free to have the reach. This is what Elon Musk says. You have a freedom of expression, but not a freedom of reach. So they can suppress your channel, you can suppress your account, you're free, you can say, but 100 people can see out of 100,000 people following you. This is a rigged game. How can I compete in such a system? As you said, the system is rigged. Steve, China is jumping the wagon. And to be honest, I followed the Chinese foreign policy, and I know that they strike the strategic deal, also partnership with Palestine or the Palestinian Authority. But now the Chinese representative or the China's foreign ministry's legal advisor, and I'm going to read what he said here. It was very astonishing because I think what he said is not only one step, but 2-3 steps ahead of the Russian position here. This is Ma Jinmin, China's foreign ministry's legal advisor, speaking on behalf of China, saying at the ICJ today, this was yesterday, that Israel is a colonizer and that the Palestinians have a right to resistance under international law, including armed struggle, which he, quote, in this context is distinguished from acts of terrorism. I just want to play what he said here and we come back.
The UNGA resolution 3070 of 1973, I quote, reaffirms the legitimacy of the people's struggle for liberation from colonial and foreign domination and alien subjugation by all available means, including armed struggle, end of quote. This recognition is also reflected in international convention. For example, the Arab Convention for Suppressing of Terrorism of 1998 affirms, I quote, the right of peoples to combat foreign occupation, aggression by whatever means, including armed struggle, in order to liberate their territories and secure the right to self-determination and independence, end of quote. Armed struggle in this context is distinguished from acts of terrorism. It is grounded in the international law. This distinction is acknowledged by several international conventions. For example, Article 3 of the OAU Convention on the Prevention and Combating the Terrorism of 1999 provides that, I quote, "The struggle waged by peoples in accordance with the principle of international law for their liberation of self-determination, including armed struggle, against colonialism, occupation, aggression, and domination by foreign forces, shall not be considered as terrorist acts."
Steve, every other nation, every other legal expert in any foreign ministry knows this, right? But they have chosen not to say it in the ICJ. China chose to be on the forefront, I would argue, to give a legitimacy to the armed struggle of the Palestinians against the Israeli side. People want to know, what does it take for China to replace the U.S. destructive role, for example, in West Asia? And can China bring an end to the bloodshed in Palestine? Or is it too early to discuss about China's increasing role in the region?
No, I think that China is playing a very important role in global politics right now, and not just in Gaza, but also it's China that's been putting forward the peace proposal to end the conflict in Ukraine. So you can see a very sharp difference in the role of China in the world and the role of the United States in the world. I think this speech was incredibly powerful, and he's taking it right into the heart of the imperialist machine, and he's quoting back to them their own legislation and their own treaties to the right of the Palestinians to resist an occupying force. Now, even Israel's status as an occupying force, I believe that's even enshrined within law, or certainly it's a status that the majority of the international community agrees upon. Now, I just wanted to come back really to roll it back a little bit, because now at the beginning of, or I say at the beginning, since October the 7th, we've had politician after politician, Western leader after Western leader, stating on national television or in their national parliaments that Israel has a right to defend itself. Now, Israel does not have a right to defend itself. Israel is an occupying force, and an occupying force does not have the right to defend itself, but it does have the right to be subjected to resistance, which it is doing so now. So, I mean, the whole of the international community is complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians. I say the international community, I mean the United States, Britain, and the usual suspects. But you look at Britain, and Britain, since the 137 days, I believe it is now, since October the 7th, Britain has licensed or given 27 arms licenses over that period to Israel. So Britain is complicit with that genocide. But of course, I think now this year is going to be quite a pivotal and interesting year in terms of this global shift, and a lot of people are, will argue that the conflict in Ukraine, for example, isn't necessarily about Ukraine. There's a whole host of things that it is actually about. One is weakening Russia, to drag out the conflict for as long as possible. It's obviously failed to do that quite dramatically. But obviously behind Russia is China. And China is really what the United States and global imperialism sees as its major threat, not Russia, but China. The other thing that they've been trying to do also is weakening the German economy, and I think that's something that has been very, very obvious. And the reasons for doing that, because Germany is the beating heart of the European Union and the economic powerhouse, or it was the economic powerhouse of the European Union. But if it can weaken the German economy, because obviously Germany had reasonable relationships with Putin under Angela Merkel. I mean, I'm not a fan of Angela Merkel, but she was a pragmatic politician. But they can then shift the European Union back into a more Atlanticist, pro-US US orbit. And of course, in the summer now, we're looking towards the BRICS summit, and this is going to be quite a pivotal BRICS summit. I think we've got more and more countries joining the alliance. We also have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well, which is again growing in strength and growing in importance. And the United States is terrified of both those organizations. But at the BRICS summit now, more nations are applying to join. There's more moving away from using the dollar as the global currency, and nations are now starting to trade in their own national currencies. But there's now talks of a special BRICS currency. I mean, I think we're probably a long way off before that comes into effect. But the US will be looking at that as a weakening empire, and it will be that once it loses control of the dollar suddenly is weakened, and it's not necessarily the global currency. It loses its ability to dominate financial markets. China is emerging. It's got the Belt and Road Initiative and Xi Jinping's modernization program. I think that is something that the United States will see as a great threat. But I can't remember which country it was now, but there was some saying, when China comes, it was one of the African nations said that, I think it might be Kenya.
Zimbabwe. Kenya or Zimbabwe. Yeah. I think Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and when China comes, they build hospitals, and when the United States comes, bombs. So I think there's a very clear distinction between the two, and I think now China is having some sway. Can it resolve the situation in Palestine? I mean, it's a decades-long issue that's, and I think the imperialist support for Israel is showing no signs of waning, despite everything that we're seeing on. I mean, this is one example of this. We were talking about the distrust in media. Now you're having every news organization in the West is very blatantly pro-Israel, and to the point, that but people are seeing through that because they can see what's happening in Gaza. They can see, what is very clearly a genocide. So there is the ability to cut through that. But I think time will tell on that. I mean, I don't know.
Speaking of the Chinese role, I just want to make a comment here. There is now an example that we can build on, and that is the Chinese mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and how Beijing helped strike a deal. And in this current climate in the Middle East, were it not for this deal, look, the Iranians, when they are escalating in the region, the foreign minister traveled of Iran many times to Riyadh, and they don't want, for example, for the Ansarullah movement and the Saudis to have clashes, side clashes, let's say. And the Saudis' diplomatic rhetoric, I would argue, is advanced nowadays when they're criticizing Israel. It's something that unprecedented. I haven't seen we know that the Saudis are closer to the Americans, and they have the under-table ties with the Israelis. But in the current climate, we see that there is a Chinese example telling the people and the countries and the governments in the region that stability is possible. And what China is doing, basically, they are telling the people and the governments that my model is that I make profits and I make gains politically and economically when you are stable in the region, unlike the United States, which economy is based on when there is war, I make profits, right? So they're presenting a different model to these governments, and these governments, when they see that there is a shift in the balance of power, and not still like it's happening slowly but surely, but they have now options. They have alternatives that they can pursue in China, in Moscow, for example. And despite all the pressures on Saudi Arabia and the UAE to sanction Russia and to cut relations with Russia, etc., they didn't listen, because they know, the Saudis and the Emiratis, that the United States is not in its peak strength like it was the case in 2003 or even in 2011. I mean, only 10 years ago, the Saudis, the Emiratis, all these Arabic countries, they were in the same military operation room fighting shoulder to shoulder against Syria. And now they are separating, and even the oil exchange between Saudi Arabia and China is going to be in yuan. So those are big changes happening in the region, right? And at the same time, we see big changes happening in Israel. And I truly believe, this is my true conviction that what Israel is doing is shooting itself in the leg. And the damage that Israel has inflicted upon itself is irreparable. You cannot repair the reputation of Israel ever again, not in our generation and not in the upcoming generation. And now we have a minister of social equity and women's advancement. I'm going to show you what she said about the Gaza Strip, because this was beyond anything that I've seen recently, especially that it's coming from the Minister of Social Equity and Women Advancement. Her name is May Golan, and she's from the Likud party. And during a Knesset hearing about the motion to expel MK Ofer Kasif, she says, quote, "I am personally proud of the ruins of Gaza, and that every baby, even 80 years from now, will tell their grandchildren what the Jews did." I mean, Joti, it's what's wrong with the Israeli officials? Aren't they aware that every statement they make can incriminate their country at the ICJ, or do they not care and they feel like they're above international law?
What you said, they don't care. They feel like they're above international law. They feel like it because they have been. These crimes are not new. They've been committing the same crimes for 75 years or even 100 years and getting away with it because they had the protection first of the British Empire, then of the US Empire. And that protection means that the one institution internationally that actually has teeth, which is the Security Council. It's not the ICJ, it's not the General Assembly, it's the Security Council. It's the only bit of the UN system that has the ability to implement anything and do something on the ground. And guess what? That's under the control of the USA. And the Israelis know it. And every single time there's been any attempt to hold them to any kind of account, the USA has blocked it and given them permission to carry on. And they have that blessing because they perform a vital function for US imperialism, for British imperialism. They are the armed outpost of Anglo-American imperialism, protecting the interests of the oil monopolies first and foremost. The control of Middle Eastern oil is what Israel is for. And Zionism is the useful tool to persuade a bunch of Europeans to come and settle in the Middle East and be this armed outpost, right? So you fill the people's head with this ideology, which is racist and supremacist. You give them an ethno-state, which is intrinsically racist and supremacist and apartheid. And then you arm them to the teeth. You give them a subsidized life so they feel themselves superior to all the people amongst whom they've been planted. And you give them, you say, clear the land, do what you want, follow God. God told you to do all these things and follow your hearts because we're right behind you. And anything it takes, we'll back you, right? And that's all you have to do. And in that, our arms money will keep flowing, our oil money will keep flowing, and everything will be fine. And we will always back you up. So 75 years or even 100 years of having that type of backing has produced not only, they've got Zionism, which is a horrific, supremacist, racist ideology, combined with this impunity. And over the years, and particularly, I think, because the resistance has been there and not gone away, the Palestinians have refused to leave, the Arab peoples in their neighboring countries have developed strong resistance movements as a result of the US domination and Israeli aggression against them, because fundamentally, Israel is a project not aimed at the Palestinian people, it's aimed at the entire Middle East. And eventually, over time, all the peoples of the Middle East come to realize that. The Arab masses understand that behind Israel stands the USA. And it's not an accident. It's not because Israel is somehow weirdly powerful. It's because Israel does an important job for imperialism. And so these people become increasingly arrogant, because they've got away with it. In the old days, they used to hide their crimes behind lying weasel words. And then they did the crimes and they talked to each other in private, the same way they now are talking in public on social media. But they've come to a point of believing that they're absolutely right because God told them, that every act of resistance is a proof that we've got to wipe these people out because God told us. I mean, that's the ideology that they're trained in. And that it must be true because, look, we do get away with it. We must be God's chosen people because no one can touch us. So, it creates a total sociopathic state of mind, psychopathic, whatever you want to call it. It's a kind of collective insanity, isn't it? And the only way to save the Israelis from themselves is the dismantlement of Israel.
And if this is the scenario that may happen in the future, there has to be a formula where the Jewish people, the Muslim people, and the Christians, and all the atheists and everyone can live together, like under one constitution, or there has to be a de-radicalization of this spot from every radical ideologies. And I'm truly for the proponent of if there is a possibility now for a two-state solution, which I don't think it's a possibility, but if there is a political possibility for two-state solution as a pre-phase to head toward a one-state solution where everyone can live in this one geography, that would be the ideal solution. This is in my humble opinion, although this is what anti-Semitism is nowadays. If you say everybody can live together, it's like you're an anti-Semite. And yesterday, actually, in Berlin schools, the police sent letters to the schools that if any student says during any session that Israel is committing genocide, then the school can call the police and these children can be questioned. So we're heading into really dystopian times. Where even when I am discussing now with you online, I have to be careful what I say, because they can just interpret whatever you say and they can fine you. They can probably send you to jail. I don't know. And I have a really bad experience with such things. But we have in these crimes that we were speaking about, for example, Julian Assange has shown us what was happening behind in the dark rooms, right, behind the curtains, and the true motives of these politicians. On the other hand, we have people who believe in, for example, a character like Navalny in Russia, and they believe this was an article published in Spiegel 2 days ago. The title goes that Navalny will be the messiah of New Russia. This was the title, and the person and the author argued that he believed that Navalny had supernatural powers, that he could not die in jail, and this is something that wouldn't have happened. Now, Steve, with this current climate after the death of Navalny, what possible scenarios do you think will happen in Ukraine, taking into consideration that every politician that I've seen, head of states in Europe and in the United States, are calling for sending more arms to Ukraine? Who's going to carry the arms and the fighting in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, where to start with this one, really? There's a lot to pick apart there. I mean, first of all, I will just say that Alexei Navalny is not the liberal hero that he's portrayed as in the West. I was quite shocked, excuse me, when I came back to London. I mean, I wasn't really that shocked, but I saw the front page of every newspaper, which was talking about, the death of a liberal hero. And they had his wife, Yulia Navalnaya, on the front page as a ready-made replacement for this liberal opposition within Russia. Now, he called it a coincidence that he died just at the same time she was about to step in front of the world's media on a global stage. But it seems too much of a coincidence for my liking anyway. But Navalny was not a liberal. He was a far-right neo-Nazi. He was describing Muslims as cockroaches that need to be exterminated and shot. He described minorities as rotting teeth that need to be pulled out, and that he was the dentist. Now, again, in the West, I had a lot of conversations since I was back, and kind of talking to people about Navalny, and they were saying, well, he was Novichok, wasn't he? And I said, well, where's the evidence for that? Because he was supposedly poisoned and then flown on a plane to Berlin, where he was treated in hospital for 3 or 4 months, I believe, before coming back to Russia. Now, if you're Novichok is a very powerful nerve agent. And if you're subjected to Novichok, you're likely to die or be very, very, very unwell. And also, all of the people that you come into contact with are also likely to be incredibly unwell. And he got on a flight from Moscow to Berlin, And miraculously, none of those people that on the flight were unwell. Miraculously, Berlin, despite being requested numerous times by the Russian authorities, have never produced the documents to say that Navalny had suffered from Novichok poisoning. So,
Steve, just a second, just to give you an example. What you mentioned here is very important. And in 2017, when the West accused Syria of using sarin gas in Khan Sheikhoun, the white helmets, they were collecting the evidence with flip-flops.
Yeah.
Sarin gas, right?
Exactly.
And it's a similar case.
Yes, I mean, it's incredibly similar. And just to give some idea for, Navalny was not a popular figure in Russia by any stretch of the imagination. And I mean, even the polls suggest that. And these are Western polls showing that he had less than 2% support among the Russian people. That's one thing that I will say actually unites the people of Russia, is their rejection of Navalny. Now, of course, they're now talking about, I think Joseph Borrell was talking about the Navalny human rights sanctions, which, I think I said at the time, if satire wasn't already dead, I mean, it sure is now. But this notion that Ukraine can somehow win the conflict is pure fantasy. It's it's impossible for them to win the conflict. I think pumping more arms and more weapons just means more arms and more weapons that one will be churned up on the battlefield. More worryingly, though, is we've seen the previously undefeated Leopard tanks churned up. We've seen the Abrams fighting vehicles, the Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicles up in flames. There was a point where the Challenger 2 tank, it was a bit of a case of where's Wally, because the Challenger 2 tank was being deliberately hidden. The British had told Ukraine, don't use it, because if you use the Challenger tank, and of course they did, it too went up in flames. So all of these undefeated Western vehicles were soon up in flames. The thing that I can tell you, because I've seen it, I'm on the ground in Donetsk, and what's happening with these weapons is they're not being used to fight Russian soldiers or the Russian armed forces. Some of them may be, but not very effectively. On the whole, they're ending up in babushkas' living rooms, or as I saw in a marketplace, 27 people massacred, babushkas cut in half, men and women by the side of the road selling fresh fruit and vegetables, killed. And these are the poorest of the poor people, and that is a war waged on them by NATO and and by the West. So these weapons aren't. I mean, and again, I saw an AGM. I have to say this: an AGM-88 HARM missile. These are missiles that are generally used to take out air defense systems. Now, I arrived on the scene again. It had destroyed an old woman's house in a very poor part of Donetsk, very close to the river. And I saw the remnants of the missile, and they have a production date and a warranty date. So, in other words, an expiration date. Now, the expiration date on this US supplied weapon was the 31st of March, 1991. So this was a 32-year-old missile, and they can't really be adapted. And there's issues, obviously, with fuel and whatever. So it was way past its sell-by date. So these are out-of-date missiles that are being rushed to the front line, because this is the other question is, okay, the West agrees to send arms to Ukraine. Where are these arms coming from? Because this was Putin said at the beginning of the SMO back in February 2022 that the aims of that were to denazify Ukraine and to demilitarize it. But he's gone beyond demilitarizing Ukraine. He's managed to demilitarize Europe, the United States, and NATO pretty much, because all of their stocks have entirely depleted. And now you're starting to see people making that link. Well, hang on a minute. How can Britain's offered a 10-year security deal package to Ukraine? I don't know how that's going to work or how they're going to do it. They certainly haven't got the resources to do it. But people are making those links between the military-industrial complex, which is making bumper profits from this proxy war in Ukraine, and the fact that in Britain, I've spoken to friends of mine. I'm in my mother's house, for example, having to negotiate her bills to be reduced because these bills are rocketing. People are struggling to put food on the table, to heat their
Yes.
homes, to make ends meet, to do the basic kind of things. It's not just in Britain, but you're in Germany. You've seen the same thing in Germany and across Europe. So people are kind of seeing those witnessing. But now you're seeing the pushback, the defeat in or the liberation, we should call it, of Avdiivka, which I left on just 2 days before, but it was imminent, and you could tell it was coming. I could tell it was coming, and it was just a matter of when. But now you're seeing this was a stronghold, a Ukrainian stronghold for 10 years, heavily fortified. And it's different from Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, whatever you want to call it, Artyomovsk, I called it. And it's different from there because now you're seeing Russian advances in other areas, and the Ukrainian forces. I mean, Ukraine itself is in crisis. There's a conflict, crisis of leadership. We saw that with the dithering over, won't he replace Zaluzhny, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, and of course he had to seek permission to sack him and replace him. So I think that there's a very, very big difficulty, and they're facing very serious problems. Russia's advancing now, so I think that there's you're now starting to see, even in some of the Western press, they're conceding that things aren't going very well for them. They're conceding that they might have to sign a peace deal with Russia actually maintaining control of the territories, in Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea, these territories that they said that they were going to retake control of. So I think that it's very unrealistic. I think they have a very unrealistic view if they think that simply pumping more arms into Ukraine is going to provide them anything.
I think they have climbed the tree too high now to there has to be someone climbing them down once again, and they are raising the rhetoric every day. And in the German Bundestag the other day, one of the speakers of the Committee for Foreign Affairs was calling for that we have to defeat Putin. This has to be the state policy of Germany, and they're committing themselves officially on a long-term support for Ukraine, which means we have to pay for Ukraine. And I just want to mention one example. The other day, I wanted to buy an olive oil. And I remember it used to cost $3.99 before the conflict in Ukraine, and it's now $7.99. This is the medium type of half a liter of oil. And if you want to buy a really good oil, half a liter is above 10 euros. And I think the middle class and below middle class are the ones who are going to suffer the most, unfortunately. Guys, before I end up this conversation, I just want to mention this again, this announcement. I launched the crowdfunding. You can find the link in the description below. And this is about a Syrian family who was kicked out of their home by ISIS in 2015. And they, at the current moment, are in Aleppo. They are a 4-member family. They were kicked out by ISIS and their home was taken over. And I am trying to manage a small taxi car for the head of the family, the father. It costs only $2,000. And if each and every one of us only donate $2 in 1 week or in few days, we can collect this money. And I can assure you that I will make sure that he gets this car so that he can put bread on the table of his family, because the situation is very, very dire. And we can see that the United States and the so-called Syrian opposition figures in Washington, D.C., in collaboration with the Zionist lobby and also the neocons, are increasing the pace of the sanctions against the Syrian people. So we have to do all we can to help as much as people we can in Syria. I would really appreciate it if you can do that. And the links, guys, of the Telegram channels of Joti and Steve are in the description below. You can also find them on X. Follow their work, support their work, listen to what they say. You don't have to agree with everything they say, and you can listen to different points of view. This is the purpose of Syriana Analysis, and you can make up your mind. Joti and Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you dedicated your time and you presented your very valuable insight to the audience of Syriana Analysis. For myself, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kevork.
Thank you.